LDS people have several distinctive practices and beliefs that set them apart from traditional Christians. We've highlighted some of those already in this doctrine module: the doctrine of God, Jesus, the gospel, grace. These are all different. We want to highlight three more important beliefs that are tied to practices. That it's important that we understand these and we know about these as we come to understand Mormonism. We're going to look at doctrines and practices that set LDS belief and practice apart from traditional Christianity. We're going to be talking about in this section here polygamy, the temple, and works that are done on behalf of the dead. Let's talk about polygamy first. In 1835, the LDS Church first published its Doctrine and Covenants. This was an update of the 1833 Book of Commandments, and in that 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, they published a section called Section 101, a declaration on marriage. In this section, it says that in marriage, the husband and wife pledge to keep themselves holy for each other and from all others. We believe one man should have one wife and one woman, but one husband. Very clear. The problem is that as early as 1831, Joseph Smith had already received a revelation, or at least purported to receive a revelation about plural marriage, and had already begun teaching that to some other members. And at some point in the mid-30s, 1830s, Joseph Smith practiced polygamy for the first time, taking Fanny Alger as his plural wife. Fanny was a woman who lived and worked in the Smith household, and he marries her. In 1843, Joseph Smith recorded what has now become known as Doctrine and Covenants 132, where he introduced polygamy in this section, which he says gives a new and everlasting covenant. And he says things that demonstrate the power of this new and everlasting covenant. He says in verse 4 of Doctrine and Covenants 132, I reveal to you a new and everlasting covenant, and if ye do not abide in that covenant, you are damned. For no one can reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory. Later on in verse 32, he says, Go ye therefore and do the works of Abraham, and enter into my law, and ye shall be saved. What is the law he's talking about? Well, it's made clear a couple verses later as they talk about Abraham being commanded to take Hagar as a plural wife. It's worth noting that in Doctrine and Covenants 132, there are some restrictions, some requirements about how those arrangements or how those polygamous relationships are supposed to come together. It mentions in verse 61 that the woman being added into the fold of a person's marriage has to be a virgin. It's likely that some of the 30 or so women that Joseph Smith married were virgins. For example, Helen Mar Kimball was 14 at the time of their marriage, and so it's likely that she was, but not all were. And we know this because at least 10 of the women that Joseph Smith married were already married to other men at the time. And so he moves them into the practice of polyandry, where one woman is now married to multiple men. In 1876, Doctrine and Covenants, what's now known as Doctrine and Covenants 132, was published alongside the rest of the Doctrine and Covenants for the first time. This is when it was added into that book that we call Doctrine and Covenants today. Doctrine and Covenants 101, that declaration on marriage was removed, and then it was supplanted then by this Doctrine and Covenants 132. It's published then, and it is still published to this day. In the time, in the 1870s, and in the 20 years or 15 years after that, that position on polygamy and the public position on polygamy took on the ire of American citizens and politicians, and so much so that in 1890 the LDS Church publicly condemned the practice of polygamy and withdrew from it. This was a time where a lot of different LDS splinter groups formed. A lot of people thought, many people thought that this new and everlasting covenant should not be able to be done away with because of political oppression or resistance. And so many splinter groups were formed, and people thought this is LDS Church had apostatized. And so there's even today in Utah numerous pockets of polygamous communities and people that practice polygamy still to this day. Within the LDS Church, most LDS members find the idea of practicing polygamy repugnant. They're very much outspoken against it, even though they still do believe in polygamy is at least a theoretical possibility, and don't seem to have a problem thinking of polygamy in the life to come. So, for example, the current President Nelson of the LDS Church has been sealed to several women in LDS temples, and so it's assumed that he will be sealed to those women in polygamous relationships in the life that comes. So it's still practiced eternally, even if it's not in mortality. LDS marriages can be for both time and eternity. This is the claim. So if you get married in a ward or a chapel or something like that, you can get married for this life. But the importance of an LDS temple, one of the things that's important about an LDS temple is that this is a place where you can get married not just for this life, but also for the life to come. The sealings done there are said to have eternal power. And so this highlights one of the important roles that the temple plays for the Mormon. The temple does not operate like a church or chapel or cathedral or something like that. There are not ongoing weekly services or worship services and things like that take place there. This is a place where you go to perform rituals, to learn things that will have in your mind a eternal significance. In order to be able to practice those rituals or do those things in the temple, you have to be worthy of it, and so you have to go to your bishop or your stake president and have a worthiness interview where you certify that you're paying your tithes, you're sustaining your authorities, you're not associating with apostates, and you're maintaining the word of wisdom, things like that. The word of wisdom is Doctrine and Covenants 89, and it says you can't drink alcohol, you can't drink coffee and tea. It also says you're only supposed to eat meat in times of winter and famine, but I don't think that's a real big part of that worthiness interview when you're there. If you pass the exam, if you pass that worthiness interview, you can get your temple recommend, where you can go through the endowment ceremony for yourself or for others later on. Typically, you would go through the temple maybe for your first time through the endowment ceremony, either just prior to your wedding or if you're about to go on your mission. When you go through the temple, you'll get your temple garments, which you'll now wear for the rest of your life as you continue to be temple worthy and enduring till the end as a Mormon. LDS faithful will acknowledge that in Old Testament times there was only one temple, and the temple functioned differently. That offered sacrifices and things like that in the Old Testament. But they claim that in these last days God has given the temple new significance, and that He's expanding them as a way to connect with more people. And so they rejoice in the fact that there are now many temples. One of the things that goes on in these temples has to do with works that are done for the already deceased, works for the dead, vicarious rituals that are performed for other people. This is one of the primary things that the temple is there for. When you go through the temple for the first time for yourself, you've learned the things you're supposed to learn. You've done the rituals that you're supposed to do. And so the reason why you go again is to perform those rituals for other people. This is one of the important functions of the Mormon's life today, is to help those who passed on perhaps without the ability or didn't have the opportunity to hear the gospel, to respond to it. They weren't able to get baptized during their life, and yet if LDS faithful are baptized with those people's names, then those people can attach faith to those works in the spirit realm or in spirit prison, and they can have those works done for them. In a similar way, in order to reach the highest levels of celestial glory, a person has to be sealed in the temple, and if you didn't have a chance to do that in this life, maybe there was no temples near you, or you didn't know that was a requirement. LDS people go to the temple to be married vicariously for others, so that those people who choose in the life to come to embrace Mormonism and all of its claims, they can have those works done for them, and they can have those works applied to them, and so can reach the highest levels of the kingdom.